The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched out like a massive bowl carved from black stone. Thousands of seats arranged in perfect circles rose up from the center floor where speakers would stand. Today, those seats were filled with beings from across the galaxy. Some looked like giant insects with shining shells. Others were tall and thin like walking trees. A few resembled humans but had blue skin or extra arms or eyes that glowed in the dark. Ambassador John Mitchell walked slowly down the long pathway to the center of the hall. His black shoes made soft clicking sounds on the smooth floor. Behind him, 3 other humans followed. Captain Lisa Parker wore her dark blue military uniform with silver buttons that caught the light. Dr. Alan Wright carried a thick folder full of papers and data tablets. The 4th human, Commander Kate Morgan, had stayed in the observation area above to watch everything that happened. John had been Earth's voice in this place for 3 years now. 3 long years of trying to prove that humans belonged here among the stars. 3 years of sharing human knowledge and helping solve problems that had troubled the galaxy for decades. He thought they had done well. He thought the other species respected them now. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The massive alien at the center podium stood up. Zethkar was a Velkarian, one of the oldest and most powerful species in the council. His body looked like a cross between a dragon and a giant lizard. Green scales covered his arms and face. When he spoke, his voice boomed across the hall like thunder. The council will now hear the motion regarding the human question, Zethkar announced. His yellow eyes fixed on John as he spoke. For too long, we have allowed this young species to expand without proper guidance. Their reckless growth threatens the stability we have worked so hard to maintain. John felt his stomach drop. The human question. They had heard rumors about secret meetings, whispered conversations in the corridors, but he had hoped those rumors were wrong. Lisa stepped closer to John and whispered, "Sir, this doesn't look good." "I know," John whispered back. "Stay calm. Let's hear what they have to say." Zethkar continued speaking to the assembled crowd. Humans multiply too quickly. They build too many ships. They ask too many questions about things that do not concern them. Worst of all, they refuse to accept their proper place in the natural order of things. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some aliens nodded their heads in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable. The Aquilians, bird-like creatures with bright feathers, seemed to be arguing quietly among themselves. The small gray beings called Centauri kept their large black eyes focused on the humans below. "Therefore," Zethkar said, raising his voice even louder, "the Council proposes the following restrictions on human activity. First, no new human colonies may be established without Council approval. Second, human military ship construction must be reduced by 75%. Third, all human artificial intelligence technology must be surrendered to Council oversight for the safety of the galaxy." The hall erupted in noise. Some aliens cheered and clapped their various appendages together. Others hissed or made clicking, sounds that seemed angry. John felt the blood drain from his face. These weren't just restrictions. This was the end of human independence. Dr. Wright leaned forward and spoke quietly to John. "They want our AI technology. That's what this is really about. They've seen what our computers can do and they want to control it." John nodded grimly. Human artificial intelligence had solved problems in days that had taken the Council years to figure out. Their computers could process information faster than any biological mind. They had used this technology to help the Council, sharing it freely to show good faith, now that generosity was being used against them. "The vote will proceed immediately," Zethkar declared. "All in favor of implementing restrictions on human expansion and technology transfer?" One by one, lights began to glow on the voting board. Red lights meant yes, blue lights meant no. The red lights came fast and steady. The Velkarians voted yes, of course. The insect-like Thraxians voted yes. The stone creatures from the granite worlds voted yes. Even some species that John thought were friends voted to restrict humanity. Lisa watched the board with growing anger. 17 red lights already," she muttered. How many do they need? Simple majority, John replied. 15 out of 28 voting members. More red lights appeared. 18, 19, 20. The blue lights came slower. The Aquilians voted no, their feathers ruffling with what looked like embarrassment. The Centauri voted no, their large eyes blinking rapidly. A few smaller species that humans had helped in recent years also voted no, but it wasn't enough. When the voting ended, 21 species had voted for the restrictions. Only 7 had voted against them. The motion passes, Zethkar announced with satisfaction. The restrictions on human activity will take effect immediately. Human representatives will remain here to discuss implementation details. John stood there for a moment staring at the voting board. 21-7. After 3 years of friendship, cooperation, and help, this was how the galaxy repaid them. He thought about all the times human doctors had saved alien lives. He remembered the trade disputes humans had helped resolve peacefully. He could still see the grateful faces of the Zephyrian children they had cured of a terrible disease just 6 months ago. Dr. Wright was shuffling through his papers, his hands shaking slightly. John, we have to do something. If they take our AI technology, if they stop our expansion, humanity will never recover from this. We'll be stuck as a minor species forever. Lisa's hand moved unconsciously toward her weapon, though she knew it would be useless here. Sir, we can't accept this. This isn't about galactic stability. This is about keeping us weak. John looked up at the observation deck where Kate was watching. Even from this distance, he could see the shock and anger on her face. He thought about Earth, about the billions of humans who had sent them here to represent their interests. He thought about the human colonies scattered across dozens of worlds, full of families who had left Earth to build new lives among the stars. Then he thought about the folder in Dr. Wright's hands. It contained plans for new medical treatments that could save millions of alien lives. It held the designs for terraforming equipment that could turn dead worlds into gardens. It included the specifications for defensive technologies that could protect peaceful species from raiders and pirates. All of that knowledge, freely offered. All of that help, given without asking for anything in return. And this was the thanks they received. John picked up his papers from the podium and straightened his tie. The hall had grown quiet, waiting to see what the humans would do. Zethkar stood with his arms crossed, clearly expecting submission and negotiation. Instead, John looked directly at the Velcarian leader and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the massive hall. Ambassador Wright, Captain Parker, we're leaving. He turned toward the exit, then paused and looked back at the assembled aliens. When you voted today, you made a choice. You chose fear over friendship. You chose control over cooperation. You chose to punish the species that has helped you the most. The hall remained silent. Even the whispering and shuffling had stopped. But you also made another choice, John continued. You chose to show us exactly what you really think of humanity. And for that, I suppose we should thank you. He began walking toward the exit, his team following behind him. With each step, John felt a strange sense of relief washing over him. The pretending was over. The careful diplomacy was finished. Now everyone knew where they stood. As they reached the great doors of the council hall, John turned back one final time. Effective immediately, humanity withdraws from the Galactic Council. Good luck solving your problems without us. The doors closed behind them with a deep, echoing boom that seemed to shake the entire building. 3 months had passed since Ambassador John Mitchell walked out of the council hall. 3 months of frantic preparation, difficult choices, and heartbreaking goodbyes. Now Captain Rick Hayes stood on the bridge of the UNS Endeavour, watching, as the last human transport ship joined their massive convoy. The evacuation fleet stretched out for thousands of miles in space. Military ships flew at the front and back like protective shepherds watching over their flock. In the middle, hundreds of civilian vessels carried everything humans could take with them: families, scientists, engineers, teachers, doctors, and farmers, all leaving behind the only homes they had known in this part of the galaxy. Final count, Captain. reported Lieutenant Amy Foster from her position at the communication station. 237 ships total, 1.4 million civilians plus military personnel. Rick nodded grimly. 1.4 million people. That was almost every human living in Council space. When word had spread about the restrictions and humanity's withdrawal, the response had been swift and clear. 92% of humans chose to leave, rather than live under Council control. What about the colonies that can't move? Rick asked. Amy checked her display. 17 permanent settlements are staying behind. They're too established to relocate. But even most of those colonists are sending their children with us. Rick understood. Some human colonies had been built around mining operations or research stations that couldn't be moved. The people there had spent decades building their communities. They chose to stay and face whatever the Council would do to them rather than abandon everything they had created. Dr. Helen Brooks approached the captain's chair. She was the head of the science division and had been working non-stop to catalog everything they were taking with them. Captain, I finished reviewing our resource situation. We have enough supplies for 6 months of travel, maybe 8 if we're careful. And after that? Rick asked. We need to find somewhere to settle permanently. Rick looked at the star charts displayed on the main screen. They were heading into unexplored space, beyond the boundaries of Council territory. The maps showed empty systems, dangerous radiation fields, and unknown threats, but they also showed possibility. Commander Foster, send a message to all ships, Rick ordered. Tell them we're about to enter uncharted space. Everyone should prepare for anything. The convoy moved forward slowly, like a great river of metal and light flowing between the stars. In the civilian ships, families huddled together and wondered what their new home would look like. Children pressed their faces against windows, watching the familiar stars grow distant behind them. On the research vessel UNS Discovery, Dr. Brooks worked with her team to scan every system they passed through. Most were empty or hostile. Gas, giants with poisonous atmospheres, dead rocks with no water or air, binary stars that would cook any planet that came too close. But in the 4th week of their journey, Navigation Officer Pete Collins made a discovery that changed everything. Captain Hayes, you need to see this. Pete's voice crackled over the communication system from his ship, the UNS Explorer. Rick activated the main viewer. Pete's face appeared, excited and nervous at the same time. Sir, long-range sensors are picking up something unusual. Artificial structures in the Kepler 442 system, about 6 light-years ahead. Artificial? Rick leaned forward. Council ships? No, sir. These are much bigger. And the metal composition doesn't match anything in our databases. Rick felt his pulse quicken. First contact with an unknown species was dangerous under the best circumstances. Leading a convoy of defenseless civilians made it potentially catastrophic. All civilian ships reduce speed and maintain distance, Rick ordered. Military vessels, form defensive positions. Dr. Brooks, I want full sensor sweeps of that system. The fleet slowed as they approached the mysterious structures. What they found defied explanation. Massive constructions orbited a yellow star similar to Earth's sun. The structures were clearly artificial but ancient beyond measure. Some were ring-shaped, large enough to encircle entire planets. Others looked like vast factories or shipyards, dark and silent after countless years. Dr. Brooks could barely contain her excitement as data poured in from the sensors. Captain, these structures are millions of years old. Maybe tens of millions, but the materials are still intact, still functional in some areas. Any signs of life? Rick asked. None. But there are automated systems still running. Very low power, like they're in some kind of sleep mode. As the human fleet moved closer, something unexpected happened. Ancient sensors that had been dormant for eons suddenly came to life. Beams of energy swept over the human ships, scanning them thoroughly but harmlessly. Captain, Pete called out from the Explorer, I'm reading massive power increases in those structures. Something's waking up. Every human in the fleet held their breath. If these ancient machines decided the humans were a threat, the entire convoy could be destroyed in minutes. Instead, something wonderful happened. The automated defense platforms that had been hidden in the asteroid fields powered down their weapons. Navigation beacons throughout the system began broadcasting friendly signals, and from the largest structure came a transmission in perfect English. "Welcome, builders. Your journey ends here. Your new journey begins now." Dr. Brooks stared at her instruments in amazement. "Captain, that message is being translated in real time. Whatever sent it is reading our computers and learning our language as we speak." "How is that possible?" Rick asked. Before anyone could answer, more information began flowing from the ancient structures. Star maps, technical specifications, and historical records filled the computers of every human ship. The data was vast and complex, but one thing became clear immediately. This place had been waiting for them. The beings who built these structures called themselves the architects. They had ruled this part of the galaxy millions of years ago, creating wonders that made even human technology look primitive. But they had not been conquered or destroyed. They had left voluntarily, traveling beyond the galaxy to explore other realms of existence. However, before leaving, they had prepared for the arrival of worthy successors. The entire system was a gift, waiting for a species with the right combination of curiosity, creativity, and determination. "Pete, take the Explorer in closer," Rick ordered. "I want detailed scans of everything." As Pete's ship approached the largest structure, docking bays opened automatically. Breathable atmosphere filled the chambers. Lights that had been dark for millions of years began to glow with warm, welcoming radiance. Dr. Brooks assembled a team to explore the structures, while the rest of the fleet established temporary camps on the habitable planets in the system. What they found inside the ancient facilities was beyond their wildest dreams. Manufacturing centers that could build anything imaginable. Power sources that drew energy from the fabric of space itself. Medical facilities that could heal injuries and diseases that human science couldn't even diagnose. Libraries containing the knowledge of dozens of extinct civilizations. But the most important discovery came when Dr. Brooks found the central archive. "Rick, you have to see this," she called over the communication system. Her voice was shaking, with excitement and something else. Anger. The archive contained the complete history of the galaxy. The real history, not the sanitized version the Council taught. The architects hadn't left peacefully. They had been driven out by a coalition of younger species who feared their power and envied their achievements. The ancestors of the Velcarians had led the attack. They had destroyed architect worlds, enslaved architect allies, and imposed their rigid hierarchy on the galaxy. Millions of years of progress had been replaced by stagnation and control. The Council species aren't the ancient powers they claim to be, Dr. Brooks explained to the assembled ship captains. They're the barbarians who destroyed the real ancient civilization, and now they're trying to do the same thing to us. Rick studied the historical records with growing understanding. Humanity exhibited the same traits that had made the architects powerful: rapid innovation, cooperative spirit, and the ability to adapt to any situation. The Council had recognized this and moved to suppress humanity before they could become a threat to the established order. "So what do we do now?" asked Commander Foster. Rick looked around at his fellow humans, scientists, soldiers, families, and dreamers, all of them refugees from a galaxy that feared their potential. But now they had something the galaxy had never seen before. "We build," Rick said simply. "The architects left all this for us. We honor their memory by becoming what they wanted us to be." Over the following weeks, human settlements spread throughout the system. Engineers worked alongside architect machines to construct new cities. Scientists decoded ancient technologies and adapted them for human use. Children played in parks that had been empty for millions of years. The refugee fleet had become something much more important. They were the inheritors of the galaxy's greatest civilization. And unlike the Council, they would use that inheritance to build rather than destroy. But as they worked and learned and grew, messages continued to arrive from Council space. The Zephyrian plague had returned, and without human medical knowledge, millions were dying. 6 months had passed since the human fleet discovered the architect homeworld. The refugee camps had grown into proper cities with clean streets, comfortable homes, and bustling markets. Children who had been frightened and homeless now ran laughing through parks filled with strange but beautiful alien plants that the architects had collected from across the galaxy. Engineer Carl Johnson wiped sweat from his forehead as he stood before the massive construction facility. The ancient machines hummed with power, ready to build whatever the humans could imagine. For weeks, Carl and his team had been learning how to operate the architect technology. It was like being given the keys to a factory that could create miracles. "Status report, Carl," came Captain Hayes's voice over the communication system. "The shipyard is fully operational, sir," Carl replied, looking up at the enormous vessels taking shape in the construction bays. "These new ships are unlike anything we've ever built. Faster, stronger, and more advanced than anything the Council has." The ships were beautiful in their own way. They combined human design ideas with architect technology to create vessels that looked both familiar and alien, smooth curves mixed with sharp angles, weapons that could punch through any known armor, shields that could deflect energy beams like they were gentle rain. But Carl knew the real power wasn't in weapons or shields. It was in the knowledge they were gaining every day. Dr. Susan Bell had made that clear during her presentation to the Leadership Council the night before. Susan was a historian who had volunteered to study the architect archives. What she found there had shocked everyone, including herself. "The truth about galactic history is nothing like what the Council teaches," Susan had explained to the gathered crowd. "The Valkyrians and their allies aren't ancient wise leaders. They're the descendants of barbarians who destroyed the greatest civilization the galaxy has ever known." The evidence was overwhelming. The architect archives contained detailed records of their final years in the galaxy. They had built a society where hundreds of different species worked together as equals. Art, science, and culture had flourished. Diseases had been eliminated. Wars had become almost unknown. Even death itself had been nearly conquered through advanced medical technology. But some species couldn't accept this peaceful paradise. The early Valkyrians, Thraxians, and several others had formed a secret alliance. They believed that the strong should rule the weak, that some species were naturally superior to others. The architect way of treating everyone equally went against everything they believed. The war had lasted for centuries. The architects had been peaceful by nature, slow to anger and reluctant to fight. Their enemies had used this against them, launching surprise attacks on research stations and civilian colonies. Billions of architects and their allies had died before the survivors finally decided to leave the galaxy, rather than continue the endless cycle of violence. They could have destroyed their enemies completely, Susan had told the human leaders. The architects had weapons that could crack planets in half or make entire stars go dark. But they chose exile instead of genocide. They left the galaxy to the barbarians and went to find peace among the distant stars. Now, sitting in her small office surrounded by ancient data tablets, Susan continued her research. Every day brought new discoveries about the galaxy's real past. She learned about species that had been wiped out for refusing to submit to council authority. She read about technologies that had been banned or destroyed because they made life too easy for ordinary people. She discovered that the rigid caste system the council enforced was designed to keep most species weak and dependent. But the most important discovery came when she found the architect predictions about the future. "Commander Hayes, you need to see this immediately," Susan called over the communication system. Minutes later, Rick Hayes stood in Susan's office reading the ancient text that had been translated into simple English by architect computers. "Young species will come from the outer regions," Rick read aloud. "They will possess the creativity of the first builders and the courage of natural explorers. When they appear, they will be feared by those who rule through strength alone. The galaxy will try to suppress them, but in doing so it will drive them to us. And when they find us, the time of the second expansion will begin." Rick looked up at Susan. "They were talking about us. The architects knew humans would come here someday." Susan nodded. "There's more. They left specific instructions about what to do when we arrived. All of this," she gestured around at the city outside, "was planned. The architects wanted us to inherit their legacy." The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't stumbled upon the architect homeworld by accident. They had been guided here by ancient planning that spanned millions of years. Every piece of technology they were learning to use had been designed with human-like species in mind. But as the humans grew stronger in their new home, disturbing news continued to arrive from Council space. Commander Frank Miller headed the intelligence division that monitored Council communications. His team had been tracking the chaos that followed humanity's departure. The results were worse than anyone had expected. The Zephyrian plague has spread to 12 worlds, Frank reported during the daily briefing. Without human medical technology, they estimate 15 million deaths in the next 6 months. Captain Hayes shook his head sadly. We offered to share the cure freely. The Council chose to reject our help. It gets worse, Frank continued. The trade disputes between the Aquilians and the Thraxians have turned into open warfare. 3 worlds have been bombed. The Centauri are threatening to withdraw from the Council entirely. Dr. Helen Brooks, who had been quiet during most of the briefing, finally spoke up. What about the colonies we left behind? The humans who stayed in Council space? Frank's expression grew grim. Mixed reports. Some are being treated well, but others are facing increasing restrictions. The Council is making examples of them to show what happens when you associate with rebels. The room fell silent. Every human leader understood the implication. Their friends and family members who had chosen to stay behind were suffering because of the Council's anger. Sir, said Amy Foster, who had been promoted to communications director, we're receiving increasing numbers of requests for help from non-Council species. Worlds that never joined the Council are asking if we can provide medical aid, protection, from raiders or just technical assistance. Rick considered this carefully. The human settlement was still small, barely 2 million people spread across a dozen worlds. They were just beginning to understand architect technology, but already their capabilities far exceeded anything the Council possessed. There's something else, Susan said quietly. I found records of other species like us, civilizations that showed promise but were destroyed by the Council before they could threaten the established order. The builders of Kepler 438, the Harmony Federation near the galactic core, the shell dancers from the spiral arm colonies, all gone. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Humanity hadn't been the first species to challenge Council authority. They were just the first to escape before being destroyed. How many? Rick asked. Dozens, maybe hundreds over the millennia. Every time a species developed too quickly or showed too much independence, the Council found ways to eliminate them, sometimes through direct warfare, sometimes through economic pressure, sometimes through manufactured disasters that looked natural. Frank pulled up a star chart on the main display. According to the architect records, the galaxy should have over 3,000 spacefaring civilizations. Current Council membership is only 287 species. The math was simple and horrifying. The Council hadn't been maintaining peace and stability. They had been committing systematic genocide for millions of years, eliminating any species that might challenge their authority. We can't let this continue, said Dr. Brooks. We have the power to stop them now. Do we? Rick asked. We have maybe 50 combat-ready ships. The Council has thousands. Carl looked up from his construction reports. Actually, sir, we'll have 200 ships ready within a month, and each one is worth 10 Council vessels in terms of combat capability. That's still not enough for a direct confrontation, Frank pointed out. Susan smiled for the first time in days. We don't need to fight them directly. We just need to show the galaxy what they really are. And thanks to the Architect Archives, we have proof of every crime they've committed for the past 1,000,000 years. Amy nodded enthusiastically. We could broadcast the truth to every world in the galaxy. Show them the real history, the species that were destroyed, the technologies that were suppressed. But first, said Dr. Brooks, we need to help the people who are suffering right now. The Zephyrians need a cure for their plague. The war zones need peacekeepers. The oppressed colonies need hope. Rick stood up and walked to the window overlooking the growing human city. In the distance, architect spires reached toward the stars, their surfaces glowing with soft light. Children played in the streets below while their parents worked to build a better future. The architects left us more than just technology, Rick said finally. They left us a responsibility to be what they were. 2 years had passed since the humans discovered the truth about galactic history. Now Admiral Paul Carter stood on the bridge of the UNS Liberation, watching as his fleet prepared to leave Architect Space. The ship around him was a marvel of combined human creativity and ancient technology. Sleek and powerful, it could move faster than light itself and strike with the force of a falling star. Behind the Liberation, 150 other ships waited in perfect formation. Each vessel carried the best of human and architect design. Their hulls gleamed with energy shields that could stop any known weapon. Their computers held the accumulated knowledge of 2 great civilizations. But Paul knew the real strength of his fleet wasn't in weapons or armor. It was in the message they carried, the truth about what the Council had done to the galaxy. "Admiral, all ships report ready for departure," announced Captain Tony Clark from the communications station. Tony commanded the diplomatic vessel UNS Harmony, specially designed for peaceful contact with alien species. "Dr. White, is your medical team prepared?" Paul asked. Dr. Nancy White nodded from her position near the tactical display. She led a group of doctors and scientists who had spent months preparing cures for diseases that plagued Council space. The Zephyrian plague was just one of many problems they could solve. "We have treatments for 17 different conditions that the Council claims are incurable," Nancy reported, "plus food supplies for the world suffering from artificial shortages." Paul smiled grimly. The Council maintained control partly by creating problems and then offering inadequate solutions. Worlds that became too independent found their trade routes disrupted or their food supplies mysteriously reduced. The message was clear: obey or suffer, but humans had learned to solve problems, not create them. "Begin Phase 1, Paul ordered. The first target wasn't a military installation or a government center. It was the Zephyrian homeworld, where millions of innocent people were dying from a disease that could be cured in hours with human medical technology. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Zephyrian system. Immediately, alarms began sounding on every Council monitoring station within 50 light-years. The humans had returned, and they had brought a fleet that sensors could barely comprehend. "Admiral, we're being contacted by the Zephyrian planetary government," Tony reported. "They're asking us to leave immediately." "Put them through," Paul replied. The main screen flickered to life, showing a Zephyrian official. The alien looked like a cross between a bird and a reptile, with colorful feathers covering scaled skin. But this Zephyrian looked sick. His feathers were dull and patchy. His eyes were clouded with pain. "Human ships, you are not welcome here," the official said weakly. "The Council has forbidden any contact with your kind." "We're not here as enemies," Paul replied calmly. "We're here as doctors. We know you're suffering from the Red Death plague. We have a cure." The Zephyrian official's eyes widened. "That's impossible. The Council's best scientists say there is no cure." Dr. White stepped forward. "May I speak to your medical leadership? We can prove what we're saying." Within an hour, human medical shuttles were landing on the Zephyrian homeworld. The alien doctors who met them were desperate enough to try anything. Their hospitals were full of dying patients. Their morgues were overflowing. Nancy and her team worked quickly. The cure was simple by human standards, just a modified version of medicine they had developed years earlier. They administered it to the sickest patients first. The results were immediate and dramatic. Patients who had been near death sat up within minutes. The terrible red rash that gave the disease its name faded away. Fever broke. Breathing became easy again. Word spread across the planet in hours. The humans had done what the Council claimed was impossible. They had cured the Red Death. But Paul knew this was just the beginning. "Tony, begin broadcasting the historical archives," he ordered. "Full-spectrum transmission to every inhabited world in this sector." The truth about galactic history began flowing across space at the speed of light. Council sensors tried to block the transmissions, but human technology was too advanced. The signals punched through every barrier and firewall. On thousands of worlds, people learned for the first time about the species that had been destroyed for challenging Council authority. They saw evidence of technologies that could have solved Their problems, but had been suppressed to maintain control. They discovered that the wise ancient leaders they had been taught to respect were actually the descendants of genocidal barbarians. The reaction was swift and explosive. On the Aquilian homeworld, massive protests filled the streets. Citizens demanded answers from their government about why they had supported the Council's oppression of humanity and other species. In the Centauri systems, emergency meetings were called as species. Leaders debated whether to remain in the Council or follow humanity's example of independence. Even on Thraxian worlds normally obedient to Council authority, workers began asking uncomfortable questions about why their standard of living was so much lower than it could be with unrestricted technology. But the Council's response was exactly what Paul had expected: violence. Admiral, Council fleet detected, reported Lieutenant Steve Andrews from the tactical station. 75 ships approaching at maximum speed. Paul studied the display showing the incoming vessels. They were led by a massive Valkyrian dreadnought, the kind of ship that had enforced Council will for centuries. Beside it flew Thraxian destroyers and ships from a dozen other Council species. "They're not coming to negotiate," Paul observed. "No, sir," Steve agreed. "Weapons are charging. They mean to destroy us." Paul felt a moment of sadness. He had hoped the Council might be willing to listen to reason, to consider peaceful reform, but he had prepared for this possibility. "All ships' defensive positions," Paul ordered. "Let them fire first. I want it clear to everyone watching who started this fight." The human fleet spread out in a complex pattern that looked random but was actually carefully calculated. Each ship knew exactly where every other vessel would be at any given moment. It was a dance of war that the Council had never seen before. The Valkyrian commander opened communications. On the screen appeared a massive reptilian face twisted with rage. "Human scum," the alien snarled. "You will surrender immediately or be destroyed." "We're here to help sick people," Paul replied calmly. "We're not your enemy." "You are a disease that must be cured," the Valkyrian shot back. "Your species should have been eliminated when you first left your home planet." Paul felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Is that what you told the builders of Kepler, the Harmony Federation? All the other species you've murdered over the centuries?" The Valkyrian's eyes blazed with fury. "Fire all weapons. Destroy them completely." The Council fleet unleashed everything they had. Energy beams that could melt mountains lanced through space. Missiles carrying planet-killing warheads streaked toward the human ships. Particle cannons fired streams of destruction that had leveled cities. But the human fleet moved like water flowing around rocks. Ships twisted and spun in impossible directions, their advanced engines allowing maneuvers that defied what the Council thought was possible. Energy shields that incorporated architect technology absorbed attacks that should have been fatal. And then the humans began to fight back. The weapons they had built combined human innovation with ancient knowledge. Beams of pure energy sliced through Council ship hulls like they were made of paper. Missiles that could think for themselves tracked down targets no matter how they tried to hide. New types of weapons that the Council had never imagined turned space itself into a weapon. The battle lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, the entire Council fleet had been destroyed or disabled. Not a single human ship had been seriously damaged, but Paul took no joy in the victory. Each destroyed ship represented hundreds of lives lost. Soldiers who had been following orders they thought were righteous. "Broadcast on all frequencies," Paul ordered. "This is Admiral Carter of the Human Liberation Fleet. We did not come here to make war. We came to help. The Council chose violence. We ask all peoples of the galaxy to remember who fired first." The aftermath of the battle sent shockwaves across Council space. The mighty Valkyrian fleet, which had never known defeat, had been destroyed by human ships that seemed to dance through space like they were alive. More importantly, the entire battle had been broadcast across the galaxy. Everyone could see that. The humans had tried to negotiate, had offered help, and had been attacked for their efforts. Within days, the first defections began. The Aquilian representative to the Council announced that his people were withdrawing from the Alliance. The Centauri followed within hours. Smaller species that had been forced into Council membership saw their chance for freedom and took it. "Admiral, Tony reported. We're receiving communication requests from 47 different worlds. They're asking for protection from Council retaliation. Paul nodded. This was what he had hoped for, but also what he had feared. The galaxy was choosing sides, and the choice would lead to more fighting. Begin Phase 2, he ordered. Send medical ships to every world that requests help, and start building our alliance. Any species that wants freedom can have it. 5 years had passed since Admiral Carter's fleet returned to Council space. Now Ambassador Julie Adams stood in the same great hall where humanity had once been humiliated and rejected. But everything had changed. The circular chamber that once held the Galactic Council now served as the meeting place for the Freedom Coalition, and the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the rigid hierarchy that had dominated council meetings, representatives from over 200 species sat as equals, Aquilians with their bright feathers mixed freely with gray-skinned Centauri. Former enemies worked together on common problems. The air hummed with cooperation instead of fear. Julie looked up at the viewing galleries where ordinary citizens could watch the proceedings. Under the old council system, only approved officials had been allowed to observe. Now, farmers and teachers and children could see their leaders make decisions that affected their lives. The Coalition Assembly will now hear the final report on galactic reconstruction, Julie announced. Her voice carried easily through the hall thanks to architect sound technology that made sure every word reached every listener clearly. Dr. Larry Evans approached the central podium, carrying a thick folder of documents. As head of the integration committee, Larry had spent the last 3 years helping former council species adapt to freedom. It had been challenging work, but the results spoke for themselves. Fellow citizens, Larry began, I am pleased to report that the transition to coalition governance is now complete in 94% of member systems. A wave of applause swept through the chamber. Representatives clapped their hands, flapped their wings, or made clicking sounds according to their species' customs. The sound was chaotic but joyful. Larry continued his report. Medical advances shared through the coalition network have eliminated 16 major diseases that plagued the galaxy for centuries. Food production has increased by 300%, thanks to improved farming technology. Educational programs have been established on every member world. The improvements were visible everywhere. Julie remembered visiting Zephyrian colonies where children had been dying from preventable diseases. Now those same worlds were thriving centers of learning and culture. But the transformation hadn't been easy. Commander Janet Ross had led the military forces that protected coalition worlds during the transition period. Many former council species had struggled with the concept of freedom. After thousands of years of being told what to do, making their own decisions felt strange and frightening. Some worlds experienced initial chaos, Janet reported when called upon. The Rigel colonies had riots when their old government collapsed. The Tau Ceti systems went through a period of lawlessness when council enforcers withdrew. But human peacekeepers had helped maintain order while new democratic governments formed. More importantly, they had shown by example that strength could be used to protect rather than oppress. The most difficult challenge had been dealing with the remnants of the old council. Not every species had joined the coalition willingly. The Valkyrians and their closest allies had retreated to fortified systems in the galactic core, where they still maintained their authoritarian rule. Attempts to negotiate with them had failed completely. They view any compromise as weakness, explained Captain Dan Murphy, who commanded the diplomatic ship UNS Peacemaker. To them, the universe is divided into rulers and slaves. They cannot comprehend any other way of thinking. Dan had tried for months to establish dialogue with the Valkyrian leadership. His ship had been fired upon 3 times during attempted peace missions. The Valkyrians had made it clear that they would rather die than accept a galaxy where they were not in control. But their isolation was becoming complete. Even species that had once been loyal to council authority were abandoning them as they saw the benefits of coalition membership. The Draconian Empire officially joined the coalition last month, reported Communications Director Amy Foster. That brings our total membership to 214 species. The Draconians had been among the most rigid supporters of the old hierarchy. Their conversion to democratic ideals had shocked everyone, including themselves. But their young people had demanded change after seeing what freedom could accomplish. Julie smiled as she remembered the draconian ambassador's speech during their admission ceremony. "We have been proud warriors for 10,000 years," the ancient reptilian leader had declared. "But we have learned that the greatest victory is not conquering others but freeing ourselves from the need to conquer." Similar transformations were happening throughout the galaxy. The coalition had grown not through force but through example. Species that saw their neighbors prospering under democratic rule naturally wanted the same benefits for themselves. The economic changes were equally dramatic. Under council rule, trade had been controlled by a few powerful species who used their monopolies to keep others dependent. The coalition had eliminated all trade barriers and shared advanced technologies freely. Production levels in member systems have increased by an average of 500%, reported Economic Coordinator Maria Garcia. Unemployment has dropped to nearly zero. Most importantly, these gains have been shared equally among all citizens. The old council had concentrated wealth among ruling elites while keeping the majority of people in poverty. Coalition worlds had abolished such inequality. Everyone had access to education, healthcare, and opportunities for advancement. But perhaps the most important change was in attitude. Dr. Helen Brooks, now serving as science director for the coalition, had been studying the psychological effects of freedom on formerly oppressed populations. Her findings were remarkable. "Creativity and innovation have increased exponentially," Helen reported. "Art, music, literature, and scientific research are flourishing on every coalition world. When people are free to think and dream and create, they accomplish amazing things." The evidence was everywhere. Coalition scientists had made breakthrough discoveries in fields that had stagnated for millennia under council control. Artists were creating works that combined traditions from dozens of different species. Children were growing up believing they could become anything they wanted. The transformation extended beyond coalition space as well. Captain Dan Murphy had led exploration fleets beyond the galaxy's edge, carrying coalition ideals to distant star clusters. What they found there both horrified and encouraged them. "The pattern repeats everywhere," Dan explained to the assembly. "Aggressive species conquer their neighbors, establish rigid hierarchies, and then stagnate. But in every region, there are also survivors waiting for liberation." Coalition fleets had made contact with refugee populations that had fled their home galaxies millions of years ago. These ancient exiles had preserved the knowledge and culture of destroyed civilizations, waiting for the day when freedom would return to the universe. "We're not just rebuilding one galaxy," Dan continued. "We're part of a universal pattern. Everywhere intelligent life exists, the same struggle plays out between freedom and tyranny." This cosmic perspective had changed how humans viewed their role in the universe. They were not unique in their love of liberty, just lucky enough to have escaped destruction long enough to fight back effectively. The architect heritage had been crucial to that success. Ancient technologies had given humanity the tools they needed to challenge the council. But the real victory had come from human values: cooperation, equality, and the belief that all thinking beings deserved freedom. "The architects would be proud," said Dr. Susan Bell, who had spent years studying their records. "They dreamed of a galaxy where species worked together as equals. We're making that dream real." As the assembly session continued, representatives discussed plans for the future. New exploration missions would carry coalition ideals to distant galaxies. Scientific expeditions would search for other architect sites that might contain additional knowledge. Cultural exchange programs would help different species learn from each other. But the most important work was happening in the schools and homes and workplaces of coalition worlds, where children were growing up free. Julie thought about her own daughter, who was learning to speak Aquilian and Centauri as easily as English. That little girl would never know a universe where species were ranked by their military power or technological advancement. To her, equality would be as natural as breathing. "Before we adjourn," Julie announced, "I want to read a message we received this morning from the Valkyrian resistance movement. The hall fell silent. Everyone knew that Valkyrian space was still under authoritarian control, but rumors of internal rebellion had been growing. To our friends in the coalition, Julie read, "We write to you from hiding, but our numbers grow daily. Young Valkyrians see the freedom you have built and demand the same for themselves. We ask only for your patience as we work to change our society from within. The dream of liberty is spreading even here, in the heart of the old tyranny." The message brought tears to eyes across dozens of species. Even the most oppressive regime in galactic history was beginning to crack under the pressure of freedom's example. As the assembly concluded, representatives began filing out to return to their homeworlds. But they carried with them more than just legislative decisions.